All right, let's take a look at the 2018 Macroeconomics FRQ number 3. Let's pull it up here. Okay, this is a good little question here. It's pretty straightforward. There are a couple of little intuitive things you need to be able to get in order to work through this question. So I think it's a decent question. It's from the very early material, some of it from Unit 1 and 2 of macroeconomics here. So let me get my pen. There it is. Okay, so countries face trade-offs between producing consumer goods and producing capital goods. Part A, country X takes 1 hour to produce a unit of consumer goods and 2 hours to produce a unit of capital goods. And then we have country Y, takes 2 hours to produce a unit of consumer goods and 4 hours to produce a unit of capital goods. Which country has a comparative advantage in the production of consumer goods? Okay, so this is a comparative advantage problem, and first thing is you got to keep in mind that this is one of those sort of upside down problems, right, where they give you the input, you know, the amount of hours it takes to produce something rather than the quantity of output, right? So an output versus an input. And this one is one of those input questions. So really, they just want you to find in part A the comparative, who has the comparative advantage. So you have to calculate what the opportunity cost is for each country, right? So let's go over here. Country X and then country Y. So we want the price of consumer goods. So we want to know how much it costs in terms of the other good, right? So we want a price of consumer good in terms of the capital good, right? So what does that mean? How many of these capital goods do we have to give up in order to produce a consumer good? So let's start over here with country X. And it takes 1 hour to produce a unit of consumer goods, but 2 hours to produce a unit of capital goods. So what is the price of a consumer good? So we have our consumer good over our capital good, right? So we could have made, or it took us two hours, right? So the price of 1 unit of consumer goods is 1/2 unit of capital good, right? Because it takes twice as long to make the capital good. Okay, so let's go to country Y, and we have 2 hours for consumer goods over 4 hours to produce a capital good. Well, let's reduce that, and what do we have? Lo and behold, we have the same thing, right? So the opportunity cost for both countries X and country Y, is exactly the same. So this is a little bit of a trick question. You know, you're really going to have to know how to calculate opportunity cost, right? And not doubt yourself that, oh, I got the same answer. So the answer to this question is that neither country. And this explanation, right, I assume if you go through and calculate or show the opportunity cost or the price of capital goods, consumer goods in terms of capital goods is both equal there, that would be enough for an explanation there in part A. All right, so now we go to one of the countries, right? The following data shows the labor market data for country X. So we're gonna go into some unemployment calculations here. Labor force participation rate. So B and C are pretty straightforward calculations. They shouldn't, you know, a problem like this should be pretty straightforward, not take you too long, but you do need to know how to calculate what they're asking for. So make sure you know what they're asking for one, read the questions carefully, and then use the table, right? Make sure you show your work. and then we'll go through here. So part B, calculate the unemployment rate in country X. So we're using this table up here. Now, interestingly, let's make some notes on here. So we've got different categories: frictionally unemployed, structurally unemployed, cyclically unemployed, and then not in the labor force, right? So if you remember how to calculate, so that's labor force. How to calculate unemployment. Unemployment rate is going to be your, let's do it like this, number unemployed divided by your labor force. So for the unemployment rate, these people that are not considered in the labor force are not counted in this formula, right? And if you remember, the labor force is essentially your number unemployed plus your number employed, right? So that's essentially this whole, all these categories up here. So let's quickly, make sure you show your work here. So we're going to get our number unemployed. So we need to figure that out because they broke it down in different categories. I won't always do this, but virtually all these different things are considered unemployed, right? So make sure you know that those are all essentially together here for our calculation. So we got 10,000. Let's see. So let's go 10K plus 5K plus another 5K. Right, so that's our number unemployed, right, of these categories. That number here, if we could do this 10, 15, so that's 20,000. And then over here, we need the labor force, right? So we have labor force is equal to the employed plus the unemployed, right? So we did the unemployed number up here. That was 20K. And then let's go back to the chart, our employed 180K. So let's do that math. That's 200,000. So we end up with 20,000 over 200,000. So our unemployment rate is equal to 10%. Okay, so pretty straightforward calculation there. Just application of the definition of the unemployment rate, and then making sure. I guess the trickiest thing you need to know is not include the non-labor force. All right, so let's go to part C. Calculate the labor force participation rate in country X. Again, show your work. Labor force participation rate is going to be, a different calculation using essentially some of the same numbers, and you got to know what that is, right? So let's go down here. Labor force participation rate is equal to your labor force, right? Our labor force up here over the whole population. So this is where, when we get this population figure, we have to include everyone, even if they're not in the labor force. So they don't count in the unemployment rate, but if you're calculating the labor force participation rate, then they do calculate towards the whole population. Okay, so labor force, this numerator here, we already did, right? That was your employed plus your unemployed. So that should be our 200,000 figure, right? That's down here. Labor force down here, 200,000. So we know that was 200. Now we have to figure out what the whole population is, right? So if these numbers here are 200,000, and then down here we're left with 100,000, we add all those together, what do we get? We have 200 plus 100, we get 300,000. So that's the whole population. So everybody falls into at least one of these categories. And then we can add them all together and be able to figure out the whole population. So we have a labor force participation rate that reduced to what, 2/3. So if you wanted to around that 66.67% of the population is employed in the labor force. Doesn't necessarily mean they are employed, right? But they're part of the labor force. So that's your labor force participation rate, 66.67%. Okay, so let's go to part D. Draw a correctly labeled graph. Here, let's create some room down here. Erase that quick. Okay. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the PPC, production possibilities curve for country X, with consumer goods on the horizontal axis and capital goods on the vertical axis. Indicate a point on your graph labeled Z that reflects the current level of unemployment. Okay, so the graph, let's do this, the first part, pretty straightforward. Now, the tricky part of this question is understanding that last thing they're asking for and what it's essentially asking for. So consumer goods on the horizontal axis and capital goods up here. So when we did part A, right, you can go back into the numbers if you want and do it again, but we were able to produce one capital good for every 2 consumer goods. So as long as you have something here that is showing a slope approximately of a half, then you're good on this curve, right? And that's the total number of combinations that country X could make of capital goods and consumer goods given their PPC curve. Okay. Now the last part here, indicate a point on your graph labeled Z that reflects the current level of unemployment. Now there is a little bit of a logical leap because you have to know what this is asking here you to define, because if they worded it in a different way, I promise it'd be a much easier question. But let's think this through, right? Current level of unemployment. So let's think about our production possibilities curve, right? Is only true, we're on that curve if we're utilizing all of our resources, right? If we're somehow underutilizing our resources, then we are not on that curve, right? So if you remember, there were some words, an efficient, inefficient, and there was also impossible. Right, those were the 3 sort of, when you drew a point on a PPC graph, you could show, right, whether you were outside beyond resources, on the curve being efficient, or somehow being inefficient. So when we think about this in terms of utilizing resources, right, let's think about the NRU. So NRU is frictionally unemployed plus structurally unemployed, right? Or unemployment rate, I guess you can think of it. So frictional plus structural. Now cyclical is not part of the NRU, right? So if cyclical unemployment rate is positive, that means somehow we're not utilizing all of our resources, right? And in this case, the cyclically unemployed number is positive, right? We have 5,000 people that are considered to be cyclically unemployed. So if you wanted to in this question, you could actually, calculate the NRU, and you should come up with a number, right, that is less than 10%, right? So we know that the actual unemployment rate we measured is above and beyond the NRU, what the natural rate of unemployment should be in this economy, right? If cyclically unemployed was 0, then we would be at the NRU. But in this case, it's not. It's positive. It's 5,000 people. So translating that back to the PPC curve, that means we need to think about some resources in our economy that are not being utilized, right? There are people unemployed. So think about it as a factory that was working, right? That all of a sudden we have unemployed. So it's not working to full capacity, right? So we need to think about this question, rephrasing it. Indicate a point on your graph, label Z, that is inefficient, right? Now that changes the whole question as long as you know what they're asking for, and you just have to draw a point somewhere inside the curve, right? Let's label it Z, and that's it, all you need to get this point for this question. I think it's a little bit of a tricky, because people may not realize, hey, that's what they're asking for, and you got to tie it back in, with the unemployment rate here. And you have to think about that, you know, with the NRU and what that means for a PPC curve.